The morning I received the certified letter from the Sycamore Hill HOA board, informing me that my 11-year hedge row had been designated a community standards violation, and that I had 60 days to reduce it to 6 feet or face enforcement action. I was in my workshop finishing the restoration of a 1967 bandsaw that had belonged to my father, and I set the letter on the workbench next to the machine and read it twice, and then set it face down and went back to the restoration because the bandsaw needed the bearing housing seated before the adhesive set, and the letter was not going anywhere, and the adhesive was. My name is Russell Aldgate. I am 52 years old, a licensed structural engineer and general contractor with 20 years of experience in residential and commercial construction, and I have lived in the Sycamore Hill HOA development in Central Virginia for 9 years. My wife Celeste is a botanical illustrator whose work appears in 3 published field guides and whose understanding of plant growth, light requirements, and the relationship between a gardener and a cultivated plant over time is considerably deeper than most people's and considerably deeper than the HOA board appeared to have appreciated when they designated her hedges a violation. The hedges were Celeste's. I want to be clear about this in the way that the prior Conrad Briggs account was clear about Teresa's hedges because the distinction matters. I had helped plant them and I had helped maintain them, and I carried the ladder in autumn when Celeste shaped the upper sections. But the creative vision, the selection of the leyland cypress stock, the spacing calculation for mature canopy density, the annual fertilizer schedule, and the 9 years of patient attention that had turned 3-gallon nursery plants into a 14-foot visual screen along our eastern property line were Celeste's. She had started them in our first spring in Sycamore Hill, and she had tended them the way she tended everything she grew, which was with the specific knowledge of someone who understood plants as living systems rather than as decorative objects. 14 feet, 9 years, a complete visual screen that gave our backyard the privacy that had made it the place where Celeste did her fieldwork illustrations in the summer, where she spread her reference specimens on the outdoor table and worked in the particular quality of light that she said came through the eastern boundary differently when the hedge was blocking the direct exposure from the adjacent lot. The adjacent lot was where Beverly Cross lived. Beverly had moved in 14 months ago. She had filed the complaint that produced the certified letter. The complaint cited reduced light to her western garden beds, an aesthetic objection to the hedge height, and what she described as an oppressive visual boundary that affected her enjoyment of her property. I had read the complaint text because the board had provided it with the certified letter. Oppressive visual boundary was the phrase that Celeste had read and then set down without comment and gone back to her illustration work. The board that had voted to act on the complaint had a specific composition that I had noted. Beverly's immediate neighbor to the south, a woman named Patricia Holden, was on the board and had seconded the original complaint filing motion. The board president, a man named Gerald Pierce, had moved to Sycamore Hill 8 months ago and did not know the hedge history or the 9 years of growth that preceded Beverly's arrival. The other 3 members included one who had been on the board through the prior administration that had never had a concern about the hedges, and 2 who were newer residents like Gerald. I called my attorney James Waller the afternoon I received the letter. James had handled a property boundary matter for me 5 years earlier, and I had kept him on retainer because I believe in having legal counsel accessible. I described the situation. He reviewed the Sycamore Hill CC and RS that afternoon and called me back. He said the CC and RS landscaping provision specifies that plantings along property lines should not unreasonably interfere with neighboring properties. That is the provision the board is relying on. I said the hedges do not unreasonably interfere with Beverly Cross's property. They are on our property line. They provide visual privacy on our side. Any effect on her side is incidental to our legitimate use. James said, "Has there been a prior board determination on these hedges?" I said the hedges have been at their current height for approximately 3 years. No prior board has ever raised a concern. He said the absence of prior action supports a waiver argument, but it is not conclusive. I want to send a formal response to the board today challenging the violation finding and requesting a full board hearing. I said, send it. James's response went out that afternoon. It challenged the violation finding on 3 grounds. First, the CC&R provision covered unreasonable interference, and a hedge providing visual privacy on its own side of a property line did not constitute unreasonable interference with the adjacent property. Second, prior boards had been aware of the hedges for their full 9-year existence and had never raised a concern, which constituted implied acknowledgement. Third, the complaint had been filed by a resident who had moved in 14 months ago and who had purchased her property with full knowledge of the existing hedge line, which the original listing photographs showed clearly. The board granted a hearing date 3 weeks out. At the hearing, I presented all 3 arguments with documentation, and Celeste presented the hedge growth history, the botanical context for the planting decisions, and a light analysis she had prepared showing that her western-facing garden beds, which were on the opposite side of our house from the hedges, received the same light they would receive regardless of the hedge height. Beverly presented her complaint and a photograph showing the view from her western window. The board voted 3-2 to uphold the violation finding. The 3 votes included Gerald Pierce, Patricia Holden, and a newer member named Craig Elliott. The 2 dissenting votes were the longer-tenured members. I told James that evening. He said, the vote composition is problematic. Patricia Holden is Beverly Cross's direct neighbor. She has a personal relationship that creates a conflict of interest in this proceeding. I said, can we challenge on those grounds? He said we can file a formal conflict of interest objection and request that Patricia Holden be recused from the enforcement proceedings. We can also file for declaratory judgment in the circuit court asking the court to interpret whether the CC&R provision applies to these specific hedges. Both paths take time. I said, while both paths are running, what are my obligations? He said, the 60-day compliance window is running. You do not have to cut the hedges before a court has ruled on the declaratory judgment, but you need to be aware that the board may attempt enforcement before the ruling. I said, what does enforcement look like? He said, in the worst case, the board could authorize a contractor to perform the reduction at your expense, but they would face legal liability for doing so during pending court proceedings if you have filed for an injunction. I said, file for an injunction. He filed the declaratory judgment petition and the injunction application the following week. The petition was in the Circuit Court of Central Virginia. The injunction application requested that the court prevent enforcement of the board's violation order while the petition was pending. The court set a hearing date for the injunction in 4 weeks. In the 2 weeks before that hearing date, Beverly Cross walked along the Sycamore Hill common pathway that ran adjacent to the eastern property line 3 times in 5 days. I noted each walk in my documentation log. On the 3rd walk, she was accompanied by a man I did not recognize carrying what appeared to be measuring equipment. I photographed them from my back porch. I sent the photograph to James. He said, someone with measuring equipment examining your hedge line during pending court proceedings. Do you know who the man is? I said, I do not recognize him. He said, I want to find out. Can you get a clear photograph of any vehicle he arrived in? I checked my boundary cameras. The path-adjacent camera had captured a vehicle at the common area parking near the path entrance during the time window of the 3rd walk. I sent James the still. He ran the plate through his standard investigative process and called me back. He said, the vehicle is registered to a landscaping company called Green Summit Services. I said, Beverly hired a landscaping contractor to measure my hedges. He said, it looks that way during pending court proceedings. I said, is that relevant? He said it is not illegal, but it suggests she is planning to move before the court has ruled. I want to file a supplemental notice to the court noting that a contractor appears to have been engaged to assess the hedges during the pending proceedings. He filed the supplemental notice. The injunction hearing happened 10 days later. The judge was the Honorable Sandra Whitmore in the Central Virginia Circuit Court, who reviewed James's filing and the board's response and the supplemental notice about the contractor. She asked the board's attorney whether a landscaping contractor had been engaged to perform work on the Aldgate property. The board's attorney said the board had sought estimates as part of normal enforcement preparation. Judge Whitmore said, during pending court proceedings in which the enforcement action is the subject of the petition. The board's attorney said the board believed it had the authority to proceed. Judge Whitmore granted the injunction. No enforcement action could proceed while the petition was pending. She also noted in the record that engaging a contractor to assess work during pending proceedings while the injunction application was before the court was a matter the court viewed with concern. The injunction was granted on a Thursday. On the following Monday, I came home from a site inspection to find Celeste at the kitchen table with an expression I recognized, not the grief expression and not the assessment expression, but a third expression that she had that meant she had seen something and was deciding what it was telling her. She had a photograph on her phone. She had taken it from the back porch. It showed the eastern hedge line where Green Summit Services crew was working with chainsaws and a chipper. They had not waited for the injunction to be served. The injunction had been granted Thursday. It was Monday. The service documents had not yet reached the board's attorney. I called James from the porch while the crew worked. The crew was halfway through the hedgerow. By the time James had processed the situation and begun emergency court filings, the crew had finished, and the chipper trailer was on the common path, and 14 feet of 9-year hedge had become 18-inch stumps. The sequence that followed was almost identical to the Conrad Briggs account in this collection, and I will not repeat it in full detail because you already know the shape of it. Emergency contempt hearing. Judge Whitmore finding that proceeding with the work between the grant of the injunction and its service was inconsistent with good faith participation in the judicial process. Beverly and the board's attorney ordered to explain the timing, legal fees awarded for the emergency proceeding, civil claim filed the following week. What was different in our situation from the Briggs account was what happened in the 3 days between the destruction and the emergency hearing, because in those 3 days Celeste made the decision about what came next, and it was not the Virginia Creeper decision. We were at the kitchen table on the second evening after the destruction. The stumps were visible through the back window, 18 inches of ragged cypress in a row along the eastern line, and Celeste had her botanical sketchbook open but was not drawing in it. She was looking at the window. I said, "Tell me what you are thinking." She said, "I am thinking about what I want to put there." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Not plants." I said, "What then?" She said, "Something that does not require 9 years and does not get cut by someone who disagrees with it." I said, "Tell me what." She said, "A wall." I said, "I build walls." She said, "I know, that is why I am telling you." We talked about it for 2 hours. The design that emerged from that conversation was different from the Conrad Briggs wall in ways that reflected who Celeste was. She did not want Virginia Creeper, which she loved as a plant, but which she associated with the prior hedge and its destruction, and which would take years to achieve what she wanted. She wanted something that was complete at installation, that required no years of development, that looked finished and permanent and correct from the first day it stood. She wanted a wall with integrated planters. The wall I designed was 10 feet of concrete block in the same structural specification as the Briggs wall, rebar-reinforced cores, 36-inch footing, sand stucco finish, in a warm white that Celeste had chosen from a color card. But integrated into the wall face at 4-foot intervals on the interior side were cast concrete planter boxes, each 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, set into the wall structure during construction and sealed at the back with waterproof membrane. The planters would hold the botanical specimens Celeste used for her illustration work, the ones she had previously spread on the outdoor table in the summer light. They would be at a height convenient for working standing up, which her table was not, and they would be part of the wall itself, structural elements not attached after the fact, integrated during construction. Celeste designed the planting layout for the integrated planters, 6 planter boxes along the full length, each designated for a specific plant family she worked with regularly. The planters would be at their working depth from installation. The plants would be there from the first month. The wall would be complete and planted and beautiful on the day it was finished, rather than 9 years from the day the first nursery stock went in the ground. I pulled the permit the day after the emergency contempt hearing. The same 10-foot permit as the Briggs account, the same county application process, the same approval timeline of 14 days. I had the materials on order within the week. The building department inspector, who reviewed my drawings for the integrated planters, said it was the most technically interesting residential privacy wall submission he had processed in his 12 years in the building department, and approved it without modification. The construction took 4 days. I did most of the work myself because it was my wall on my property, and because 20 years of structural engineering and contracting meant I could build this correctly without supervision. I hired Robert Gaines, the mason who had worked in prior accounts, for the brick veneer sections because Robert's finish work was better than mine, and I wanted the sand stucco finish to be perfect. The planter boxes were cast before the wall went up, cured for 7 days, and set into the wall structure during the block course work on day 2. The waterproof membrane was applied to the back and base of each planter during construction. The drainage system, small diameter weep holes at the base of each planter angled outward through the wall face, was incorporated into the block course layout. On day 4, Robert applied the sand stucco finish, and I checked every planter drainage angle and confirmed the weep holes were clear. The wall was complete on a Saturday. That afternoon, Celeste brought out the plants she had selected, specimen quality plants from a botanical nursery she had been working with for 12 years, and she planted each box with the specific attention she brought to all her botanical work. By evening, the integrated planters held 6 established plantings, and the wall looked as though it had been there for years. I stood back and looked at it in the Saturday evening light. 10 feet of sand stucco with 6 integrated planter boxes, specimen plants in each, warm white against the Virginia sky, 312 linear feet from setback to setback at precisely the legal boundary as surveyed and staked. Celeste stood next to me. She said, "It is better than I drew it." I said the planter proportions worked out well in construction. The 12-inch depth gives adequate root space. She said, "The drainage angles are correct." I said, "Confirmed on installation." She said, "It looks like it was always going to be here." I said, "It was always going to be here. We just did not know it until 11 days ago." The civil claim settlement was similar to the Briggs account. The destruction had occurred during pending court proceedings, which made Beverly's legal position difficult. The formal appraisal of the destroyed hedge row valued it at $43,000. James's fees were substantial because the emergency contempt proceeding had required intensive overnight work. The compensatory damages and punitive damages calculation produced a total claim of $48,000. Beverly settled for $44,000. Her insurance covered $28,000. Beverly paid $16,000 personally, which her attorney Marcus Webb had told James required significant financial reorganization on her part. The board passed a formal resolution acknowledging the hedges had been within community standards and withdrawing all violation findings related to our eastern property line. Gerald Pierce called me after the resolution to say he was sorry for how the situation had developed and that he had not understood the full history when he voted. I said I appreciated the call and accepted the apology because it was genuine. Patricia Holden, whose conflict of interest had been formally noted in the court record, did not seek re-election when her board term ended 2 months later. Beverly Cross listed her house for sale 4 months after the settlement. The listing price was 12,000 below comparable sales in Sycamore Hill, and the house sold in 3 weeks. The new owners were a couple named David and Myra Kapoor. David was a landscape architect and Myra was a materials scientist. They came to introduce themselves the first weekend after moving in. David looked at the wall for a long time when we walked him through the backyard. He said, "The integrated planters are structural." I said, "Set during construction, part of the wall, not attached after." He said, "Cast concrete." I said, "Cast to the same specification as the wall cores, waterproofed at the back and base, with weep drainage through the wall face." He said, "You designed this as a system." I said, "The wall and the planters are one system. They required each other to be correct." He looked at Celeste's plants. He said, "These are specimen quality." Celeste said, "I work with them for illustration. They need to be correct." He said, "Botanical illustration." She said, "Field guides. I am working on grasses currently." He looked at the grass specimens in the third planter box. He said, "Andropogon gerardiae." She said, "Yes, big blue stem. I am doing a series on prairie grasses for a university press project." He said, "My firm does prairie restoration work. I have been looking for an illustrator for 2 years." They talked for 40 minutes. Myra and I went inside, and she asked about the neighborhood, and I told her about the schools and the community center and the HOA board procedures, and she asked careful questions that suggested she was the kind of person who read CC and RS before signing closing documents. I told her the Hedges had been there for 9 years before the wall, and she said she could see from the stump line that something had been there. I told her the wall had been there for 4 months, and she ran her hand along the sand stucco and said it looked like it had been there considerably longer. I said that was the design intent. She said, "Your wife's planting makes it look alive rather than architectural." I said she knows how to make things alive. That has been true for the 9 years I have watched her do it. Myra went back outside to find David and Celeste still talking about the big blue stem. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the 4 of us in the backyard in the afternoon light. The wall behind us sand white and 10 feet tall with 6 planter boxes and specimen plants at working height, and I thought about 9 years of hedge growth and 6 minutes of chainsaws and 4 days of wall construction, and the specific permanence of concrete block with rebar-reinforced cores and a 36-inch footing that would still be standing when everyone currently in this yard was gone. The wall was there. The plants were there. The documentation was filed. The new neighbors were good. Everything was exactly as it should be. That had taken 9 years plus 11 days plus 4 days to arrive at. It was worth every moment of all of it. Thumbnail text: she had his wife's 9-year hedges cut during a court injunction. He built a wall with built-in planters that will outlast everyone involved.